The dispatcher's voice came through the static just before midnight, December 10, 2009, thin, mechanical, but steady. Pinal County Sheriff's Office, what's your emergency? The woman on the line was fighting for breath. My husband, Jesse Capon, he went into the mountains 3 days ago, looking for the lost Dutchman mine. His GPS stopped moving 18 hours ago. Keystrokes clattered as the dispatcher pulled up the topographical grid of the Superstition Wilderness. Another missing man. Another dot swallowed by those volcanic spires east of Phoenix that rise from the Sonoran Desert like the spine of some buried beast. They've stood there for 18 million years, black tough and basalt stacked against eternity, their cliffs eroded into shapes that seem half-designed, half-accidental, a labyrinth the land itself refuses to map. Long before park rangers or prospectors, the Apache called this place the dwelling of the thunder god. Spanish conquistadors, stunned by the pale ash crowning the peaks, christened them Sierra de la Espuma, the mountains of foam. To everyone else they became simply the Superstitions, a name that sounds almost harmless until you stand beneath them and feel how still the air becomes, as if even wind hesitates to cross their shadow. History clings here like dust. In 1863 a German immigrant named Jacob Waltz arrived in the Arizona territory with hands calloused from years of mining and eyes that kept their own counsel. Locals nicknamed him the Dutchman, though he corrected them whenever he bothered to speak at all. For years he scraped by on minor claims around Wickenburg and Prescott, barely enough to eat, never enough to matter. Then, abruptly, in 1891, he began paying for everything with gold nuggets so pure the Phoenix assayers could only stare. Asked where he'd found such ore, Waltz would smile and tilt his head toward the Superstitions. He told barroom companions of a vein so rich you could pry gold from the walls with a knife. He mentioned landmarks, a spire called Weaver's Needle, a canyon that burned red at sunset, a cave aligned with the morning star. By the time fever took him that October, legend had already eclipsed the man. On his deathbed he muttered directions to Julia Thomas, the neighbor who nursed him, words she scrawled down between tears and uncertainty. Those fragments became the first of 100 maps promising fortune to anyone brave or foolish enough to follow them into the maze. But the mountain's hunger didn't begin with Waltz. Decades before he ever set foot in Arizona, another name had already been written in the dust. In 1848, Don Miguel Peralta led 400 men north from Sonora, miners, laborers, mules heavy with supplies. They vanished into the Superstitions and re-emerged as legend. Apache warriors struck their convoy in what would later be called Massacre Canyon. A handful of survivors staggered back across the border telling of mules spilling gold ore onto the sand, of companions cut down before they could load their guns. None returned to retrieve the treasure they swore was left behind. Even their descendants would not speak of it. The century turned, and the pattern deepened. Maps surfaced like weeds, some inked on parchment, others etched onto animal hide, a few scratched in pencil on the backs of bar receipts. Each claimed to trace Waltz's steps. Each led someone to ruin. In 1931, Dr. Adolph Ruth, a 78-year-old veterinarian from Washington, D.C., arrived carrying a map he swore belonged to the Peraltas. He told anyone who would listen that he'd be back within a week, rich beyond measure. 6 months later searchers found his skull near Willow Spring, his body hundreds of yards away. The coroner called it a perfectly round hole in the cranium. No one could agree whether it was bullet or blunt fate. Beneath his rib cage lay his checkbook, the final entry scrawled in a steady hand, Veni Vidi Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. After Ruth, the mountains tightened their grip. Treasure hunters armed with metal detectors, survey gear, and newfound faith in technology kept marching in. Some crawled back out empty-handed, limping and burned by sun or madness. Others were found months later as skeletons bleached clean by the desert. Many were never found at all. In 1947, James Cravey became one of them, the first to bring a metal detector into the Superstitions. 9 months after he entered, a ranger stumbled upon his remains near Needle Canyon. The device lay beside him, its batteries long dead. Wrapped in oilcloth, his journal had survived the weather. The last line read, "Found old shaft, explore tomorrow." No such shaft has ever been located. Today the Superstition Wilderness sprawls across more than 160,000 acres of protected terrain. Cell signals die within minutes of the trailheads. GPS units blink madly, their coordinates leaping miles between heartbeats. Compasses spin as though the Earth itself forgets its north. Rangers have logged temperature swings of 40 degrees between adjacent canyons. Streams shown on old maps evaporate, new springs appear where none existed. It's as if the land shifts its own bones while no one is watching. Maybe that's why people still come, to challenge something older and larger than themselves, to trace a story they think they can finish. But the superstitions don't end, they end you. Every name on the missing person ledger is a chapter the mountain kept for itself. Long before the gold maps faded and the GPS signals began to die, the mountain had already chosen its pattern: bait, pursuit, silence. The Peralta massacre had set the tone, but it was the 20th century that gave the superstitions its reputation as a graveyard for the curious. By the time the modern age rolled in, the desert had already taken the shape of an endless trap, jagged ridges hiding canyons that bent back on themselves, washes that disappeared beneath sheer basalt walls, shadows that shifted with impossible precision. Treasure hunters came anyway, driven by old words and the promise of gold that might outlast mortality. They came because the legend said the mountain owed something to those who dared ask. But the mountain pays no debts. By the summer of 1931, the name Adolph Ruth had spread through Arizona like rumor on the wind. The old veterinarian's obsession with a family map and a half-mad dream of fortune had made him a curiosity in the taverns of Superior. He was gray, bent, almost frail, but there was a fire behind his spectacles, the kind of certainty that only ever ends one way in these hills. He told a waitress he'd be gone a week, maybe 2, and when he returned he'd buy the whole town dinner. 6 months later, cowhands found his skull near Willow Spring. The rest of him lay yards away, ribs picked clean, boots still upright in the dust. The coroner noted the small, perfect hole in the skull. Could be a bullet, he said. Could be a fall. No one could agree. Under the shattered ribs they found Ruth's checkbook, miraculously intact, with one line written in a deliberate, almost triumphant hand: Veni Vidi Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Some said it was bravado, others thought it was prophecy. Either way, the mountain took it literally. After Ruth, the search for the Dutchman's gold changed shape. Radios replaced mules, cameras replaced journals, but the ending stayed the same. In 1947, James Cravey hiked in carrying a new device few had ever used, a metal detector. He wrote to his wife that he'd found a shaft older than memory, and that the next day he would enter it. He never made it that far. 9 months later, rangers found his bones near Needle Canyon, his equipment resting neatly beside him. The metal detector's power cells were drained, but his journal survived under waxed canvas. The final entry ended mid-sentence: light from below, not sun. The shaft he described has never been located. Time marched on, but the disappearances kept rhythm. The mountain didn't need reasons, only opportunities. Its silence was enough. The wilderness spanned more than 160,000 acres, and the deeper one went, the less the world seemed to follow. Within minutes of leaving the paved roads, phones went mute, compasses spun, and even the sky felt too still. Rangers began recording strange anomalies: valleys that stayed 40 degrees cooler than the next canyon over, water sources that vanished overnight, entire ridges misaligned with their mapped coordinates. By then, the stories had already begun shifting from lost treasure to something less tangible: lost time. Among those who lived long enough to speak of it was Robert "Crazy Jake" St. Marie. For 3 decades he chased the Dutchman's shadow through those canyons, carving his obsession into notebooks and scar tissue alike. A rattlesnake nearly killed him in 73, a shattered kneecap crippled him in 79, but he kept going back. The mountain fights you, he told a Phoenix reporter in 1989. It doesn't want to be found out. Trails disappear. Rocks fall for no reason. Your gear breaks. Then your mind goes. I've seen my dead brother up there, 3 times, standing in a side canyon waving me forward. When St. Marie finally died in 2001, his journals were donated to Arizona State University. Inside, archivists found something far stranger than any map: 47 logged incidents he called time slips. One entry from March 1982 read like a scientist's autopsy of reality: left camp at 0600. Sun position confirmed. Reached Terrapin Pass, normally 2 hours. Arrived to find sun overhead. Watch read 6:45. 6 hours missing. No fatigue. Canteen still full. As if I jumped forward without moving. There were dozens more like it, all in the same handful of coordinates he'd marked by hand. No one could explain it, least of all him. He returned to those points over and over, certain that something waited behind the curtain of ordinary time, something that allowed the mountain to choose who stayed and who vanished. In 1964, 2 Phoenix attorneys, Robert Kringle and Robert Lee, decided to test the legend through law and logic. They spent months analyzing mining claims from the 1880s, tracing signatures and survey records until they believed they'd pinpointed a vein described in territorial documents. They hiked in with metal detectors and measuring equipment, confident they'd end the myth and retire wealthy. 2 weeks after their scheduled return, park rangers found their car at First Water Trailhead. Their camp was discovered near Blacktop Mesa, tents upright, supplies untouched, even the coffee pot clean. The only oddity was where their metal detectors were found, 300 feet up a sheer cliff face, carefully placed on a narrow ledge. Neither man owned climbing gear. Neither man was ever seen again. By the time the 1970s ended, the disappearances had become a quiet epidemic. Veterans, hikers, prospectors, professors, names written in ink and forgotten. In 1959, Stanley Fernandez vanished while hiking with friends near Weaver's Needle. They'd agreed to separate for an hour and regroup at camp by sundown. He never arrived. Searchers found his pack at the base of a cliff, its contents arranged neatly as though he'd stopped for lunch. His body was never recovered. In 2012, a Hawaiian geology teacher named Benjamin Ferrer entered the mountains with satellite imagery and seismic data, determined to solve the riddle scientifically. 3 days later, his rental car was found at the Peralta trailhead, doors locked, GPS on the seat, coordinates leading deep into the wilderness. Search teams combed 30 square miles. They found nothing, not a boot print, not a scrap of cloth. It was as if the man had been erased mid-step. By then, technology had replaced myth, yet the results stayed the same. Every decade, someone new arrived believing they were smarter, tougher, or more prepared. Every decade, the mountain corrected them. It said that when night falls in those canyons, the rocks whisper if you listen too long. Maybe it's the wind, maybe it's the dead, or maybe it's the sound of the mountain taking inventory, remembering the names it's already claimed, and wondering whose turn is next. The mountain's appetite didn't slow, it adapted. By the late 20th century, the superstitions had devoured more scientists, soldiers, and hobbyists than gold-fevered prospectors. Each decade added new ghosts to its ledger, and by the time the world entered the digital age, the wilderness east of Phoenix had become less a place and more an experiment, something ancient measuring how far human obsession would go before it broke. The names in the archives read like fragments of a curse, each echoing the same pattern: discovery, certainty, silence. Those who survived spoke in circles, as though words themselves bent around what they'd seen. Those who didn't left behind journals, cameras, or half-charged devices that died mid-signal, freezing the last proof of their lives in static. Robert "Crazy Jake" St. Marie had written of time slips, but few took him seriously until the evidence began repeating in other hands. His journals, brittle and sweat-stained, spoke of hours that vanished without memory, of compass needles that locked in place, of voices calling him by name from somewhere just beyond the ridge. He'd mapped the spots where reality seemed to flex, marking them with small cairns of volcanic stone. Decades later, rescuers found those same piles, still standing, untouched by erosion. The coordinates formed a ring, a pattern so precise that geologists at Arizona State called it mathematically improbable. Maybe St. Marie was mad. Or maybe he was the first to notice the mountain breathing. The 1964 disappearance of attorneys Kringle and Lee confirmed that intelligence offered no protection. They weren't drifters or thrill seekers. They were professionals armed with court-verified mining deeds and the kind of reasoning that comes from believing the law can tame anything, even legend. When their camp was found near Blacktop Mesa, everything sat in meticulous order, beds rolled, maps spread across a crate, pencils sharpened to perfect points. The food was untouched, as though they'd stepped away for a moment and never returned. But their metal detectors told a different story. They had been found 300 feet above the campsite on a narrow shelf of stone, perfectly balanced side by side. No one could explain how they'd been placed there without climbing gear, or why anyone would bother. Helicopters couldn't reach the ledge safely. The devices were retrieved years later by a technical team using ropes, and both detectors still powered on. Their last recordings captured only a steady, rhythmic beeping that cut off mid-tone, as if the machines themselves had fallen silent mid-sentence. In the decades that followed, the vanishings accelerated. The superstitions began to gather people like static gathers dust. Maps, technologies, even logic itself seemed to warp the closer one walked toward Weaver's Needle, the jagged spire that legend claimed watched over the Dutchman's gold. Pilots reported instrument drift overhead, hikers reported hearing their own names whispered from the brush. Radio operators picked up bursts of Morse code that translated to nothing but repetitions of the word down. The wilderness wasn't just hostile, it was recursive, folding the same stories over itself again and again. Then came the modern seekers, the ones who carried satellite beacons and topographic overlays, who believed data could untangle myth. In December of 2009, 35-year-old Jesse Capon from Colorado vanished while chasing the legend he'd studied for 3 obsessive years. He'd interviewed miners' descendants, tracked every archival map, even charted his own digital composite of Waltz's supposed directions. His girlfriend later told investigators that he'd grown secretive in the weeks before the trip, paranoid that someone was watching him, stealing his work. Search teams found his body wedged in a vertical crack 35 feet up a cliff, as though he'd fallen mid-climb toward a cave that matched one of Waltz's described landmarks. His backpack lay far below, intact. Inside were a satellite phone, GPS unit, and 2 weeks of supplies. None of the survival gear had been touched. The phone's last coordinate placed him a full mile from where his remains were found. No one could explain the gap. Capon's camera was the true horror. Investigators recovered 347 photographs, each time-stamped in precise intervals over his 3 days in the mountains. The first 200 were harmless, trails, rock formations, wide desert skies. But the rest defied sense. Shadows appeared in shapes that didn't match their sources. Figures blurred at the edge of the frame, half seen, their proportions wrong, arms too long, faces stretched like reflections on rippling glass. Photo 267 showed Capon's own silhouette on a boulder, yet beside it loomed another shadow, humanoid but disfigured, the limbs warped, the head bulbous, as if something stood next to him that light couldn't quite register. The last 80 photos were pitch black. Forensic techs confirmed they were taken in full daylight. Whatever the lens had seen, the camera refused to remember. The mountain kept adding names. Each case drew attention for a moment before fading into the larger pattern, another warning swallowed by time. But some refused to let go. Among them was Ruth Krangle, widow of the lawyer who'd vanished in '64. Every spring for 22 years she returned to those ridges, hiring guides to follow the same hopeless trail. She wasn't looking for gold anymore, just bones, or maybe proof that the mountain had a conscience. In 1986 she finally found something. Not her husband, but a cave sealed behind a false wall near Needle Canyon. Inside, she discovered rusted mining tools from the 1870s, a scattering of human remains, and words carved into the rock itself. Hundreds of them. Most were in Spanish, some in English, a few in languages no university could identify. The messages all said the same thing in different ways: leave while you can. It watches. The walls move. They speak in our voices. The newest carving was barely a month old when Ruth found it. It read, "They walk in the stone. Don't trust anyone you meet here." By the late 1980s, even the Apache elders who still spoke of the mountains began to fall silent when questioned. Those who would speak described the place not as cursed, but sacred in the old sense of the word, dangerous, forbidden, alive. Sacred like a warning, one storyteller said. Not because it blesses, but because it remembers. The U.S. Forest Service records tell the rest in cold ink: 97 missing persons between 1960 and 2023 within the wilderness boundary, 23 never recovered. The others, those found, often raised more questions than they answered. Climbers discovered at the base of cliffs they had no reason to descend. Experienced hikers dead of thirst within sight of running water. Perfectly healthy men and women whose autopsies listed cause of death as undetermined. And between each tragedy, the same uneasy silence from the land, as if the mountain, having fed, had gone back to sleep. For the living, the superstitions had become both riddle and mirror. Each new seeker thought they were chasing gold or history or closure, but what they were really chasing was reflection, the faint echo of something older than faith, something that looks back when you stare too long into the stone. And in that reflection, the mountain decides who returns. Ruth Krangle's discovery should have been the end of it, a final chapter carved in stone, a warning spelled out by the dead. Instead, it only deepened the hunger. News of the cave spread through Phoenix like a fever dream. The tools, the bones, the scrawled messages that spoke of movement inside the walls. Reporters hiked into the wilderness expecting myth and came back silent. Archaeologists argued over translations. Linguists from 2 universities examined rubbings of the inscriptions and found fragments that matched ancient dialects no longer spoken anywhere in the Southwest. One line, etched deep into the rock in crude English, was burned into every article that followed. They walk in the walls. They speak with our voices. For the old Apache families who still lived near the reservation boundaries, that sentence carried no surprise. It was something they'd been saying for centuries, only no one had ever listened. Mary Hoffman, a White Mountain Apache storyteller, told a journalist in 2018 that her people had always avoided the superstitions for a reason. "It's not sacred like church sacred," she said. "It's sacred like a warning sign. The mountain doesn't want us there. It remembers what was taken. It takes back in its own way." Her words didn't make headlines, but they resonated with anyone who'd read the growing list of missing person reports. Between 1960 and 2023, the Forest Service recorded 97 disappearances within the wilderness boundaries. 74 bodies were eventually recovered. The rest remain unaccounted for. Those that were found offered no peace, bodies positioned as if gently laid down, no signs of struggle, gear untouched, heart inexplicably stopped. Others died of dehydration within sight of running creeks, or collapsed from exhaustion though their packs still held food and water. Official reports labeled the deaths environmental misadventure. Locals had another term, taken. The psychologists arrived next, drawn by what they called the Dutchman syndrome, a pattern of escalating paranoia and fixation among those who entered the mountains too often. Dr. Patricia Holbrook, who studied the phenomenon for 15 years, described it in her unpublished field notes as a consistent descent into obsession, accompanied by auditory hallucinations localized to the wilderness region. Her subjects spoke of whispers that used their own names, of hearing their partners call from far away when those partners were safe in camp. Some claimed to see movement between the saguaro cacti at dusk, tall, thin silhouettes that dissolved when approached. Holbrook initially dismissed the accounts as collective suggestion until she recorded identical testimony from hikers who'd never met or even heard of each other. Two described the same thing, shadow figures flickering between rocks as if caught mid-step between one world and another. Geologists had their own explanations, but even those veered into uncertainty. The mountains were riddled with mine shafts, hundreds of them, most undocumented, many collapsed. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in 2007 revealed over 400 hidden voids in a single square-mile sector. Engineers blamed magnetic anomalies in the volcanic rock for the compass failures and GPS drift, but even they couldn't explain the acoustic distortions, echoes that traveled for miles without fading, voices repeating themselves minutes later in the same tone, as though the stone were rehearsing. What unnerved the surveyors most were the places where sound disappeared entirely, where even shouting vanished a few feet from the source. One technician described it as, like the air itself refused to carry your voice. The survey was halted after several pieces of equipment malfunctioned beyond repair. Officially, the budget ran out. Unofficially, no one wanted to go back. Then came Travis Marlowe. In 2016, he and his partner, Scott Williams, entered the Superstitions with the precision of men who believed calculation could tame chaos. They were amateur explorers, not treasure hunters, following what they claimed was a new interpretation of the Peralta stones, those infamous carved tablets said to hide the mine's coordinates. On their second night, Marlowe woke to find Williams gone. No footprints, no note, no sign of struggle, just an empty sleeping bag and a silence that pressed against his ears. For 2 days he searched before his GPS failed completely, coordinates looping on themselves as if he were walking in circles. By the 5th night, delirious and starving, he looked up from his fire and saw Williams standing on a ridge silhouetted against the stars, motionless. Marlowe called out, but the figure didn't move. At dawn he climbed to the ridge, no tracks, no sign anyone had been there. He saw the figure twice more during his 11-day ordeal, always at a distance, always silent. When rescue teams found Marlowe near death from dehydration, his story seemed like trauma-induced delusion, until the details began to unravel something deeper. 3 days after he was airlifted to Phoenix, Williams's credit card was used at a Tucson gas station. Security footage showed a man of similar height and build paying cash at the pump. The image quality was too poor for confirmation, but the man drove away in Williams's truck. The vehicle was later found abandoned in New Mexico. No fingerprints, no explanation. If it was Williams, he'd had weeks to contact anyone, family, friends, even the authorities. He never did. Hospital records from Marlowe's recovery painted their own nightmare. Nurses reported him speaking in his sleep in a language that no one recognized, a guttural mix of Spanish, Apache, and something older. During those episodes, his voice deepened into something that seemed borrowed. He spoke of the ones beneath, of veins of gold that pulsed like arteries, of tunnels that breathed. On his third night, security cameras captured him sitting upright in bed at exactly 3:17 a.m., eyes closed, arm outstretched, pointing directly toward Superstition Mountain 40 miles away. He stayed frozen like that for 13 minutes before lying back down without waking. When questioned later, he remembered nothing. The hospital dismissed it as neurological stress, but the story reached the reservation within days. One elder told reporters that Marlowe's description matched an old legend, the stone sleepers, spirits trapped within the mountains since before time began. They dream through the rock, she said. When men dig, they wake. By the time the footage surfaced online, the case had already joined the archive of disappearances, another cautionary tale filed between myths and police reports. The mountains were no longer just a wilderness, they'd become a mirror for every kind of fear, scientific, spiritual, existential. To the treasure hunters, they promised gold. To the rationalists, an unsolved puzzle. But to those who'd listened long enough, who'd watched the horizon pulse at dusk and felt the ground hum under their boots, they were something else entirely. A reminder that some places aren't lost, they're waiting. And waiting is what the Superstition Mountains do best. By the end of the 1990s, the Superstition Mountains had stopped being a legend and become a question no one could answer. The stories were too many, too consistent. Each generation of searchers believed their technology or faith or intellect would break the cycle, yet the mountain always found a new way to win. By then, rescue teams had stopped calling them disappearances. They called them closures. When the helicopters circled back empty, when the GPS logs ended mid-transmission, when the desert swallowed the trail, the report simply concluded, case closed. No one said lost. The word had started to mean something different there. Then came the Barks, Tom, Linda, and their daughter, Sarah. Experienced rescue volunteers, professionals in every sense. They weren't chasing gold or ghosts. Their mission in 1998 was technical, to test new emergency locator beacons along known danger zones. They carried the best equipment money could buy, topographic maps, military-grade GPS units, and satellite radios. For the first day, everything went as planned. On the second, the wilderness began rewriting itself. Near Whiskey Spring, Sarah noticed that the canyon ahead didn't match their map. It wasn't a minor difference. The entire landscape seemed rotated, as if some unseen hand had twisted it while they weren't looking. Peaks that should have been east now stood to the north. Valleys ran backward. Tom double-checked their position with triangulation, and the results made less sense than the view, each landmark displaced by precisely 1.3 miles in a counterclockwise arc. They radioed the anomaly to base camp. The Forest Service cross-checked their readings and reported no discrepancies. From orbit, the terrain was exactly where it should be. But on the ground, the Barks saw something else entirely. Linda's journal from that night, later recovered with their gear, described their confusion in shaky handwriting. Tom thinks magnetism's interfering, but that doesn't explain what we're seeing. Weaver's Needle should be northeast. We can see it to the northwest. The whole range is wrong, like a mirror image. Sarah sketched maps in her notebook, one from the satellite overlay and another from what surrounded them. The two versions were identical in shape but reversed, as though they were walking through a reflection of the real superstitions. When rescue teams reached their location 3 days later, all three were found alive but disoriented, unable to agree on which direction they'd come from. Tom's compass was frozen at due south. His GPS showed a coordinate that didn't exist on any map. 2 decades later, science finally caught up with what they'd seen. In 2019, a geology team from Northern Arizona University brought electromagnetic survey equipment into the same region to study mineral composition. What they recorded shouldn't have been possible. Instruments picked up magnetic pulses deep beneath the surface, slow, rhythmic beats unlike anything naturally produced. The readings intensified at dawn and dusk, fading in between as if the earth itself breathed. Several devices failed completely, their internal storage wiped clean. The team's report noted strong interference consistent with an artificial signal source, though the nearest radio transmitter was 40 miles away. Funding for follow-up research was quietly denied. Technology fared no better for the civilians who came next. In 2021, a commercial drone photographer lost 3 high-end drones in a single day near Hieroglyphic Trail. Each one shut down mid-flight with full battery. The crash footage ended with the same flicker, half a second of impossible geometry, canyon walls bending at unnatural angles before the image went black. When he recovered the wreckage, every memory card was blank. He stopped flying after that. Even the rescuers began whispering. Chief Martin Gonzalez, 30 years with the Superstition Fire Department, told a journalist off-record, "You can plan for heatstroke, snakes, bad climbs. You can't plan for what happens in winter." He said that's when the strange calls came in, reports of lights in empty canyons, of hikers walking in circles for hours while convinced they were moving straight. "We had a professor swear he'd been gone 3 days. His wife said he'd been missing 3 hours. The mountain's edges weren't safe either. Property owners along the foothills came and went, selling cheap to the next family willing to ignore the silence. The Ramirezes lasted a year before their daughter began waking up at night, swearing she saw miners crossing the backyard, lanterns flickering, faces pale as moonlight. The cameras caught nothing. The Johnsons who bought the ranch next claimed their livestock refused to graze on pastures that faced the peaks. Electric fences failed weekly. They left after 2 years, abandoning half their tools in the yard. When the archaeologists arrived, they thought they were studying prehistory, not prophecy. Dr. Elena Vasquez of the Forest Service cataloged over 200 ancient habitation sites scattered through the wilderness, pottery shards, grinding stones, charred fire pits. What unsettled her most was how abruptly they'd been left behind. Meals half-prepared, tools mid-use, fires still warm when their owners had vanished centuries ago. "It's as if entire villages just stood up and walked away," she wrote in her 2020 report. Her final expedition, in 2019, would change everything. Behind a rockfall in an unmapped canyon, Vasquez's team found a hidden chamber. Its walls were painted with more than 300 handprints made from red ochre, spiraling inward toward a narrow hole in the floor that dropped into pure darkness. Carbon dating placed the oldest prints at 1,400 years, the newest less than a decade old. Ground-penetrating radar showed a vast tunnel system spreading beneath them like veins. The Forest Service sealed the entrance immediately, citing safety hazards. But Vasquez's private field notes, later leaked by a colleague, told a darker version. "Third night in the cave. Heard drumming from below, rhythmic, lasted 1 hour after midnight. Recorded it, files corrupted. Maria saw someone on the ridge. Modern boots. Tracks ended mid-stride. Same dream every night, tunnels breathing, something moving in the dark behind us. Recommend immediate classification." After that, Vasquez stopped leading field work. She never spoke publicly again. The cave remains sealed, but locals say that when the wind comes out of those canyons after sunset, you can still hear the rhythm she described, slow, deep, and steady, like the heart of the mountain counting down. By the time Dr. Vasquez sealed her final report, the Superstition Mountains had already claimed another life. In November of 1988, Phoenix photographer David Polita set out before dawn to capture the sunrise from Flatiron Summit. He was no thrill seeker, just a quiet professional chasing perfect light. He'd climbed the route dozens of times. That morning, he told his girlfriend he'd be home by noon. When he didn't return, she called for help. Search teams found his truck at the trailhead, his camera bag abandoned halfway up the slope, and his body shattered at the base of a 500-foot cliff. The official report called it a fall, but the evidence told a stranger story. The coroner couldn't determine if he'd slipped or jumped. His watch had stopped at 5:48 a.m., minutes before sunrise. The final roll of film was recovered from the wrecked camera, 24 exposures taken in under 30 seconds. The first frames showed dawn breaking clean and still. Then, by frame 6, the impossible began. Spheres of light drifted through the sky, multiplying with each shot. By frame 18, a massive triangular shape loomed over the peaks, its surface etched with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The final frames were washed in a glare bright as noon, though the timestamp still read before sunrise. In one of the last images, Polita himself stood at the cliff's edge, his shadow cast in 4 directions at once. The incident should have been written off as distortion, but experts who examined the negatives couldn't agree on a cause. Light leaks couldn't explain the symmetrical geometry, camera malfunction couldn't account for the shifting shadows. The film was placed into storage, but several technicians who handled it later reported the same dream, a vast chamber underground, filled with machinery and distant breathing. None of them returned to film work. The disappearances didn't stop there. In March 2024, drone racer Marcus Webb entered the Superstitions with gear that would have made NASA jealous: autonomous drones, satellite beacons, GPS trackers broadcasting his location every 10 minutes. He planned to scan cliff faces too steep for human access. For 6 hours, everything went smoothly. Then his beacon fractured, transmitting from 5 locations at once, each miles apart. An hour later, every signal went dark. His camp was found days later, truck locked, equipment neatly arranged, no footprints leading away. 5 months after the search was called off, a hiker found Webb's drone controller half buried in a dry wash 7 miles from his camp. Somehow, it had stayed powered for 72 days after his disappearance. The last video it contained began as a normal flight log. Then the image shifted, Webb's own face appeared, staring directly into the lens, lips moving though the audio carried nothing but a low, vibrating hum. The hum intensified until it became a tremor that shook the playback equipment itself. The remaining 16 hours of footage couldn't have been filmed by Webb. The timestamps were dated weeks after he vanished. The drone's camera darted through canyons at impossible speeds, passing through solid rock as if the mountain were transparent. The final hour showed a vast subterranean complex filled with mining equipment from every era, Spanish picks beside modern excavators, all spotless, untouched by time. Figures moved among them, faces hidden beneath shadows that refused to obey light. Each time technicians enhanced the images, their software crashed. Every one of them later reported the same recurring nightmare, working endlessly underground, unable to look away. Private investigator Samuel Morrison had seen too many coincidences to call them chance. For 15 years he tracked disappearances across the Superstitions, compiling a database of 341 cases dating back to 1850. He noticed the rhythm no one else did. Every 7th year, the vanishings tripled, beginning on the spring equinox and ending at the summer solstice. Always in groups of 3, always exactly 33 hours apart. The pattern had held for nearly 2 centuries. Morrison's obsession led him to an even darker discovery: the returners. People who vanished into the Superstitions and came back, alive but wrong. 28 such cases, all identical: extreme anemia without blood loss, mineral buildup in the lungs suggesting months of breathing underground air, and a lattice of faint scars across the scalp visible only under ultraviolet light, geometric patterns no doctor could explain. One returner, Jennifer Hayes, disappeared in 2019 while hiking with friends near Peralta Trail. 6 days later she walked out of the desert 50 miles away, barefoot and unburned, though she'd carried no water. Hospital tests showed she hadn't eaten or drunk anything the entire time, yet her body displayed no dehydration. Under hypnosis, she described being in a place she called the Between, a world inside the mountain where time folded and the rock itself breathed. The corridors moved, she said. The walls opened and closed like lungs. They spoke, but not with voices. They showed me the true shape of things. The session ended abruptly when her voice shifted into a dialect no one could recognize, later identified as pre-Columbian, extinct for 500 years. By then, Morrison had stopped looking for gold. He began to believe the legend had been a cover all along, a story to lure the willing into something the mountain required. The gold was never the treasure, he told an interviewer before vanishing himself in 2022. It was the bait. The mountain feeds on faith. If you stand at Weaver's Needle at sunset, the desert glows like molten glass. The rocks hum faintly, too low for ears but deep enough for bone. Sometimes, when the wind dies, a voice carries across the canyons, a single word repeated in languages no one living can name. Maybe it's just echo. Maybe it's the mountain remembering. The mountain remembers everyone who's ever stepped beneath its shadow. It holds their breath, their fear, their final thoughts inside the stone. You can feel it if you stand still long enough, an echo beneath your feet that isn't quite vibration, isn't quite heartbeat. They say that when the wind cuts through those canyons just right, it carries the voices of the ones who vanished. Maybe that's superstition. Maybe that's proof. Either way, the Superstitions don't care which version you believe. They've outlasted miners, soldiers, surveyors, and satellites. They'll outlast us, too. Morrison's notes ended mid-sentence. The file on his desk had been left open, cursor blinking against a half-finished word, return. When they found his truck abandoned at First Water Trailhead, the passenger seat held a map covered in dates and hand-drawn concentric circles. In the center, he'd written 2 words, the Between. The same phrase Jennifer Hayes had used months before. The same phrase that appears, faintly, scratched into the walls of old mines near Weaver's Needle. Investigators later claimed Morrison's files were corrupted, hundreds of photos replaced with blank white images. Others said that when the recovery team plugged his laptop into a generator, it emitted a low hum that made their teeth ache until they pulled the plug. None of that made it into the report. Officially, he's just another missing person. Every few years, someone new shows up convinced they can solve what the others couldn't. They bring drones, thermal imaging, LiDAR scans, and equations that promise to make sense of what's never been sensible. They pack their gear, study the routes, and drive toward those sawtooth peaks like pilgrims heading to confession. Some come back with sunburn and stories. Some come back different. And some never come back at all. Their names join the others, written on the Forest Service's filing cabinets, etched into stone somewhere deep in the range, whispered by the wind that slides between the ridges after dark. If you ask the locals, they'll tell you the mountain is alive. Not metaphorically, alive the way coral reefs or glaciers are alive. It moves slowly, in deep time, shifting unseen beneath the desert crust. They'll tell you it listens. That it understands when someone speaks its name with too much certainty. The mountain likes questions, one old guide said. It doesn't like answers. To him, the gold, the maps, even the disappearances were just bait, the way the land keeps people curious long enough to draw them in. It's not the treasure that kills, he said. It's the wanting. The U.S. Forest Service keeps releasing their numbers, search and rescue data printed in calm government font. 97 disappearances. 23 unsolved. But numbers can't describe what happens there. They can't capture how a compass spins in circles until it drills a hole through logic, how a man's shadow bends away from him at noon, or how photographs taken in broad daylight come back black. They can't measure the feeling that something under the surface is watching. That maybe it always has been. Every so often, hikers report strange lights, slow, deliberate, never random. Others hear footsteps pacing outside their tents when no one's there. Drones crash without reason, their footage erased. And sometimes, when someone's gone missing, search teams pick up emergency beacons flashing in impossible places, signals bouncing from 5 coordinates at once, as if the mountain can't decide where it put the body. Most searchers stop asking questions after dark. What if the mine was never real? What if Jacob Waltz wasn't the first to find something, but the first to see it, the doorway, the breathing corridor, the shape that isn't supposed to be there? Maybe the gold was only the part humans could understand. Maybe everything since, the maps, the expeditions, the blood, has been the same story told in different languages, all leading back to one truth no one survives long enough to write down. Stand at the trailhead at dusk and you'll feel it, the air heavier than it should be, the smell of iron and rain even when the sky is dry. Look long enough into the ravines and you'll see the light shift, not like sunset but like the earth blinking. The Apaches called it sacred for a reason. Sacred doesn't mean holy. It means dangerous. It means not for us. Tomorrow, someone will wake up certain they've cracked the code. They'll print a new map, charge their batteries, and drive toward the mountains. The sun will rise behind Weaver's Needle, spilling light across the same ridges that swallowed Jacob Waltz, Adolph Ruth, Jesse Capon, Marcus Webb, and all the rest. The desert will hold its breath, pretending to be still. And when night falls, the counting will begin again, soft at first, like a pulse, like the start of a song the earth's been humming for centuries. So what do you believe? That the missing are just victims of heat, cliffs, and bad luck? Or that the mountain takes what it wants? Either way, the superstitions wait, patient, ancient, and endlessly hungry. They don't care if you come armed with maps or prayers. They only care that you come, and when you do, they'll be listening. And that's the story of Vanished in the Superstition Mountains, a place where maps twist, time bends, and the earth itself seems to breathe. What do you think really happens out there? Are these vanishings just accidents, or is the mountain hiding something deeper? Let me know your thoughts down below. If you enjoyed this dark journey into the unknown, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another haunted expedition. This is Captain Rebel, signing off. Stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some mysteries aren't meant to be found.